Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this beautiful day. We thank you for the beautiful temperature. And we especially want to thank you for this class and Bob and Tess as leaders and the wisdom that they bring to us. And we want to pray for those in our class that are sick, and Jerry and Jean Benedict and Rodney. And we want to pray that eyes get better, just incrementally, little by little, doing your will. And we want to pray that we can soak in the wisdom of the lesson and learn more about you. In Jesus' name, amen.
My wife said that she reminded me that back years ago I used to always start my Sunday school classes with a joke, and I haven't really been doing that. You know, sometimes I might say something funny, but it's almost inadvertent. So I thought I'd start with a joke today. And actually, she tells me sometimes my jokes don't go over real well, which may be why I don't do it very much. But anyway, I have a cat joke I'd like to tell you. Police officer stops a man who's driving down the street in his car, and he notices that when he stops him that he's got a Siberian tiger sitting in the passenger seat. And he says, "Sir, you have a Siberian tiger. Don't you realize you really need to go take him to the zoo?" He says, "Okay, thank you." And so he lets him off, and a week later he's driving down, he stops the same man. And he and the Siberian tiger both have sunglasses on. He says, "Sir, I thought I told you last week to take him to the zoo." He says, "Well, we did. We had a great time, and today we're going to the beach."
Lawrence, why are you laughing?
That was funny. That was funny.
Thank
I'm
you.
laughing on the inside.
Okay.
All right, we are in chapter 4, the death of Ishbosheth. How many of you have read chapters 4 and 5? Raise your hand, don't lie. You need to stay a couple chapters ahead of time, ahead of where we are. Today we're going to start at least chapter 5. So, but you remember who Ishbosheth was. Remember, he was the son of Saul. He was set up as the king of the northern kingdom Israel by Abner, and as we concluded, I think last week, he was something of a puppet king. You know, he was not a very strong leader, and Abner was kind of pulling the strings, so to speak. But Abner was murdered, you'll recall. I think that's where we left off. Is that correct? Abner was murdered. Did anybody remember where we left off?
Yes, that's
Yeah. And so the death of Abner reverberated throughout Israel. It shook the confidence of King Ishbosheth, as well as the entire population of his kingdom. Even the king's own men were shaken by this. And, you know, I think most of you, Jamie, you would not be in this category, but I think that most of you remember where you were when President Kennedy was assassinated, when you found out. Okay? How many of you can remember exactly where you were? Okay? Lawrence, you probably don't remember either. When were you born?
65.
You certainly don't remember because you weren't even in the womb yet. So, and Jamie, I know you don't remember. So.
When he killed in 69?
No,
3.
3.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but I remember exactly where I was, and I remember the shock that. Well, actually, we were in a magic show. I was in 5th or 6th grade. I can't remember. Probably 6th grade, and they interrupted the magic show to tell us the news. And this just shocked the nation. The assassination, and then later on Martin Luther King Jr., and then Bobby Kennedy. So we became, you know, almost immune to shocks like that. But the killing of Abner was just a horrific thing by Joab, and you know, as I've indicated to you before, I think Joab was kind of just a sleazy character. He fascinates me. I've often wanted to write a book about him, And by the way, I signed a contract for that 100 books this past week. So I am now officially under contract. Yeah, I have to get it to the publisher next March. So I have to get a book that could take years, decades, centuries to write. And I got to get it out next March. So pray for me, along with the other stuff that I'm working on. So, but anyway, the king's own men were shaken enough that it led two of them to betray Ishbosheth and murder him in his sleep. So without Abner, Ishbosheth had no real support for the throne. And again, Ishbosheth really pretty much alienated Abner by accusing him of sleeping with one of his concubines. And so he lost a lot of support right there. I think it was unlikely that Ishbosheth was also very unpopular with many of his countrymen. Now, they didn't have, sophisticated polls where they could call you up and, find out, what the approval rating was. Anybody know what Biden's approval rating is right now? Probably a little low right now, but I would imagine that Ishbosheth had a very, very low approval rating if they had those polls and if they had telephones, but they didn't. But we're told that the two men were Beerothites from the tribe of Benjamin in verse 2. Now, the Beerothites were so named not because they liked to drink beer, okay, but because they were from the tribe of Benjamin from the city of Beeroth. Now, Beeroth was a Gibeonite city that had made a covenant with Israel back in the time of Joshua. Do you remember back in the book of Joshua, the Gibeonite deception? Remember the Gibeonites, they were trying to exterminate the Canaanites. And so the Gibeonites came to Joshua, and they had old moldy bread. Right. And they said, we had come from a long way away. And basically they lied, but Joshua made a covenant with them. And so even though it was obtained under false pretenses, they honored that contract. And so they said, you're going to be slaves and water bearers and wood bearers, but we will not kill you, which I think was a pretty good deal. So they were for the Gibeonites. And so now we're told that Beeroth was now a Benjamite city, and that its original residents had abandoned the city to live in a place called Gittam. By the way, Gittam was a much less desirable location. It's quite likely that some of these Benjamites had been given this Gibeonite city as a royal grant by King Saul. And so it's very important that the writer identify the assassins as Benjamites. In other words, David had nothing to do with the murder of Ishbosheth. Okay? It was his own tribal kinsmen who killed him, not David's supporters. What was Saul? What was the tribe that he was from? Remember? He was from the tribe of Benjamin. And so, like father, like son, the son would also be a Benjamite. And so he's murdered by Benjamites. Okay, and that's significant, isn't it? It means that David had nothing to do with it. And that's really important to the writer of 1st and 2nd Samuel. That David, not be seen as complicit in, trying to, get rid of Saul, try to get rid of Ishbosheth. And so before the details of the murder of Ishbosheth are given, the writer is careful to point out that there's another possible heir in Saul's dynasty besides Ishbosheth. Jonathan, David's best friend, had a son named Mephibosheth. I noticed that people don't name their children after these. You know, they name them David or Jonathan, but you know, not Ishbosheth or Mishbosheth. And I wonder why that is. Well, I've just thought about that. But anyway, we're told that Mephibosheth was 5 years old when his father died, and that his attendant dropped him, and he became crippled in both feet. Now, I don't know how this happened, but he became lame. And it's clear from his description that he was no threat to David. And so his lameness would have made him an unlikely candidate for the throne. Now, unlike someone like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who came before my time, but he was able to effectively serve as our president during a time of war, despite the fact that he was in a wheelchair. He had been crippled by polio, and my understanding is, and again, I was not around back in those days, but you know, the media tried to not portray him in a wheelchair because it would make him look ineffective and ineffectual, which was not true at all, because he was a very, very effective leader. He is usually found on the list of great presidents that we have had, you know, along with Washington, Lincoln. But anyway, his lameness did not affect him, but in the ancient time, in the ancient world, a king who was crippled would be unlikely to lead. And why would that be? Anybody have an idea?
Because he couldn't go to war.
Yeah, absolutely. He couldn't, you know, a king was expected to lead his troops in battle. You know, it's not like today, you know, he just signs off and says, okay, you all go. He was expected to actually lead them. And you'll remember that that's how David got into hot water when he was older, remember? And in a time when kings went to war, remember? He was looking at Bathsheba, you know, he had his binoculars out and was looking at Bathsheba and saying, hubba, hubba. Remember? Instead of going to war like he should have been. But I think this is also a reminder to us that Saul's family line was not completely destroyed. And so we're going to see Mephibosheth is going to show up later in chapter 9, and he'll be a major player in the story. Okay, so let's go back to the murder of Ishbosheth. Two of Ishbosheth's own men, and if I say that name enough, I'm going to really screw it up. So please bear with me. But try saying Ishbosheth quickly 5 times.
Bob, I wonder what his friends taught him. Ishi?
Ishi.
Yeah, let's give him a nickname.
You know, I sometimes wonder about these names. You know, for example, there's a woman in the book of Numbers, and her name was Hogla. And I don't know about you, but I just have a picture of her. I really have a demented mind, I think, sometimes. Forgive me, Lord. Anyway, 2 of Ishbosheth's own men snuck into his house in the middle of day, and remember, they did it under false pretenses. They murder the king while he slept and cut off his head. Okay? Then they brought the head to David, probably thinking what?
Will be rewarded.
Yeah, they're going to get brownie points. They're going to get rewarded. And it's clear that these men did not understand David. Do you remember how he responded to the Amalekite who said that he had killed King Saul? What happened to him?
It didn't work out too well for him.
No, it did not work out too well. And he thought that David would be pleased by the report that he had killed King Saul. Instead, he forfeited his own life because he dared lay his hand on the Lord's anointed. Likewise, these two men, we're told that they are Rechab and Baanah, were executed for their crime, not rewarded. Furthermore, their dismembered bodies were put on public display as a warning to others. Now, keep in mind, yes,
Would they have been with David, say, when he was fleeing from Saul and Saul was in the valley and David was in the cave and Saul came in? Would these men have been with him? I mean, if they were with him at that point in time, I mean, they
well,
should have.
if they were with Ishbosheth, they would have probably been with Saul, yes, probably.
Okay. That's true, yeah.
They would have been with Saul.
Yeah, but I mean, when they know what happened, you would think that they would have thought, hey, wait a minute, David is not looking for retribution,
Well, they apparently didn't thunk it out too well.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
They didn't do the thinning around here. Remember Quick Draw McGraw? Oh, do the thinning around here.
That was, but again, the word, word traveled slow back then too, so. And they might not have, maybe he hadn't heard that story about the.
Apparently, they may have missed it on CNN, but anyway, that's interesting. Now keep in mind that David's actions would likely have received approval from those in the northern kingdom. And then David had Ishbosheth's head buried with Abner in Hebron. Okay? You might have noticed that throughout chapters 3 and 4, very little has been said about the role of God in all of these events. It's kind of like the book of Esther, which has no mention of God, but you see God throughout. But there's no mention of God. Where is God in all of these evil murders? Joab killing Abner. These two men killing Ishbosheth. Where is God in all of this? Why is God absent? Yet the promises of God are fulfilled through the unwitting and sinful actions of sinful people. And so God can use someone like Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, to punish the Israelites and take them into captivity for 70 years in Babylon. Now, we Christians often think of providence in terms of fortunate turns of events that God directs. Yet, more often than not, providence will use sinful human actions to accomplish the purposes of God. And so, you think of the evil actions of the high priest and Pilate in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Was the death of Jesus the sovereign plan of God to pay for the sins of mankind? Yes, it was. Of course it was. Okay, whoever has Acts chapter 2, verses 23 and 24, would you read that, please? As the Apostle Peter states in the book of Acts. Who has that one?
I got it. It says, this Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. God raised him up, losing the pangs of death, because it was not possible to be held by it.
Okay, thank you. Another really good example, I think, is from the Bible, is Joseph. Remember Joseph? He was one of 12 sons of Jacob. He was sold into slavery by his jealous brothers, and he wound up in Egypt. I remember that story in Sunday school or Vacation Bible School. That's one of the first stories that you learn about the coat of many colors and how he was sold into slavery. And so Joseph winds up in Egypt in prison. And later in life, he realized that it was in reality God who had sent him to Egypt to save the lives of his family during that famine. And so you remember what Joseph said to his brothers? His brothers were afraid that he was going to have them killed, remember? Especially after Jacob died. And he said, "You meant it to me for evil, but God meant it for good." Okay? And so here we see God working through evil human actions to kill David's rivals and install David as king. And you recall that David said that, if I'm going to become king, God's going to have to kill Saul, not I. He wasn't going to have a part of that. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Okay, please do not misunderstand what I'm saying. Sometimes people misunderstand me. I make it misquoted. But I am not suggesting that God causes human beings to do evil. God did not cause Joab to murder Abner. And God did not cause the two Beerothites to murder Ishbosheth. And God did not cause Joseph's brothers to sell him into slavery. Okay? Is that clear? God's providence is seen not in causing people to make sinful choices, but by working within the free choices that people make and weaving them into his plan. That's the providence of God. And so the two murderers of Ishbosheth were judged by David, and their bodies were hung over a pool in Hebron as a public denouncement of their deeds. Ishbosheth was buried, at least his head was, with full military honors in the tomb of Abner. So how do we respond to the actions of David at this point? John Davis wrote a book. He was a professor at in Winona Lake at Grace Theological Seminary. You probably never heard of him, but he wrote a really good book about 1st and 2nd Samuel called The Birth of a Kingdom. And he writes, and I quote, "One cannot help but be impressed with the ethical and political sophistication of David that David brought to Israel's politics. This was in contrast to the approach adopted by King Saul. David did not follow this philosophy that the end justifies any means. He was convinced of the providential and sovereign control of his God. He believed that in the proper time, the way would be open for the reunification of the land and the establishment of one throne." Unquote. So he sees David as being, somewhat politically astute here in the things that he's doing. And if you keep in mind that some of the things that he could have done might have really alienated people, especially in the north. So anyway, let's move on to chapter 5, where we have the reign of David, unless anybody has a question or thought. In 2 weeks, I think, what's happening? We have a combined service. We meet at 9 o'clock in the morning. When is the clock change?
That day.
We're going to lose an hour.
Forward.
Actually, we're going to be losing an hour, and we're going to be meeting early. Okay.
Good luck.
Do I need to call everybody?
Yeah. Just text
You should
them,
bring
Bob.
fresh donuts.
I don't text.
Yeah,
Go to
right.
Dunkin' Donuts.
Okay. Lawrence has volunteered to bring fresh donuts from Dunkin' Donuts. Thank you so much. We appreciate that. So, no, he's joking.
Yeah.
All right, the reign of David, Israel's greatest king. 2 Samuel chapters 5 through 20. After 7.5 years of failure and division, now I know what you're thinking, 7.5 years? It just seems like it happens just like that, because we did it last week, right? But 7.5 years have passed. Okay, I guess time flies when you're having fun. But after 7.5 years of failure and division, it was clear that the nation could not afford the luxury of division anymore. David had, for many years, been recognized as a champion of Israelite causes and had for over 7 years proved himself to be a worthy king in Judah. Now, with all the legitimate heirs to Saul's kingdom dead, the road is paved for David to be crowned king over all of Israel. This is actually initiated by the people from the north, from Israel, who approached David at his capital in Hebron. So we have the consolidation of his rule in chapters 5 through 8. Now, I think it must have been a pretty impressive sight to see all of these tribes from the north coming to Hebron to meet with David. They give 3 reasons for the consolidation of his rule. First of all, they recognize that David had already been anointed king of Israel. And so the people note David's calling to shepherd Israel. Notice that word shepherd? We sometimes use that as pastors as well. And I think this is fitting in that David actually started out as a, what was his occupation?
Shepherd.
He was a shepherd, yes, to his father's sheep. In ancient Near Eastern literature, the word shepherd was a title used of kings. For example, in the Code of Hammurabi, I know you've heard of Hammurabi, right? The Babylonian king says, I am Hammurabi, the shepherd, selected by the god Enlil. So, this is in line with what was happening in other countries at this time. Secondly, they reminded David of their common heritage. They said, we are your own flesh and blood. And then finally, they recognized that David had played an important part in Israel's military history. They said, you are the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. So there's a threefold logic here when they come to David. And I'm going to have to take this off. I'm hot. Anybody hot? No. I'm going to stop at this. Okay, don't worry. I'm really hot. Okay. David becomes king over all Israel. Verses 1 through 5. So finally, David is anointed king over all of Israel. And this is a long time after. This is, over a decade after he was anointed by Samuel.
He was anointed at 13, 14 years old. Something like that.
I would
Pretty
think
close,
probably more
something.
than 17, but anyway. But we're told that he made a covenant with the people. Now, covenants between a king and his people were common in the ancient Near East. And so most of these covenants express some sort of mutual obligations. You're familiar with the term quid pro quo. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. And whoever has Numbers 4:3, please be ready here. But the subjects were to show loyalty and obedience to the king. In turn, the king pledged himself to being a just ruler who protects his people. Now, we're also told that David was 30 years old when he became king in Hebron, and that he reigned for 40 years. So he reigns for 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem, roughly. So When David became king over all of Israel, he was 37 years old. So actually, this is probably maybe at least 20 years after he was anointed. Now, in ancient Israel, the age of 30 was thought to be the age when a man entered his prime. And it was the minimum age for an Israelite to be qualified to work in the tabernacle. So whoever has Numbers 4:3, please read, and Luke 3:23, please be ready.
Okay, from 30 years old up to 50 years old, all who can come on duty to do the work in the tent of the meeting.
Okay. And then interestingly enough, there was another person that you probably have heard of who began his public ministry at the age of 30.
Jesus was about
Go ahead.
Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his public ministry. Jesus was known as the son of Joseph. Joseph was the son of Heli.
Okay. Thank you. So when David began to rule over all of Israel, he was about 37 years old. Now, in the Western world, our expectations for leaders are similar. For example, in the United States, according to Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, the president must be at least 35 years old at the point of assuming office. And he also must be a natural-born citizen who has lived in the United States, I think it's something like 13 years. But you might recall that when John F. Kennedy became president, there was a lot of talk about two things. Number one, that he was a Roman Catholic, and number two, his age. Yeah. And you'll recall, too, that there was a question about Ronald Reagan's age when he became president. Yeah, and one of the great quotes that he used was, I'm not going to make an issue of my opponent's youth. He was in his 50s, I think, wasn't he? So. But anyway, on the other side of the coin, a professional athlete is generally considered to be on the downside of his career when he's 37 years old, unless he's Tom Brady. And I think that, before he retired, which I think shocked a lot of people, there were people that were expecting him to be playing into his 80s, But anyway,
not yet.
I'm a Redskins fan. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I remember when George Allen became the coach, and he started getting guys out of retirement, older guys in their, 30s, like 36, 37, and they were called the what? Over the Hill Gang. And they actually went to the Super Bowl, I think in 1972 or 3, and lost to Miami. That was the year that Miami was undefeated. But anyway, 37 years old is usually considered kind of over the hill for a professional athlete. You see that Roger Federer, for example, is, how old is Roger Federer?
About 37.
He's about 37, and he's looking a little shaky now. I don't know that he's ever going to win another major. Nadal, may win another major or two. And Djokovic, for sure, but he's younger. But 37 is a little bit over the hill. Some of us were over the hill at 25. But anyway, Bill Arnold, in his commentary, writes of the political ramifications. He says, David's rise to power makes Israel the rising star in the region. Okay? So, in verses 6 through 10, we have David capturing Jerusalem. And I'm going to be asking whoever has Joshua 15 and to read in just a minute, so be ready. So, David's first move as king is to establish a new capital for the unified kingdom. It was important for all that it be centrally located. After all, the southern city of Hebron would have been considered unsuitable by the northerners. because Judah, it wasn't a part of their their geography, and so it was best for him to choose a neutral location, a city that wasn't part of Judah, and it wasn't part of the northern Israel. And so it was important that the new location not give political advantage to either the north or the south. And I'm not sure what all the ramifications were that went into Washington, D.C. becoming the capital, because Philadelphia was at one time.
Right.
But it may be that Philadelphia was considered to be too northeastern. But Washington was kind of the compromise. Does anybody know anything about that? Yeah.
No.
No.
I was just going to say we're going to watch this play out in Ukraine right now because Kiev is close to the Russian border.
Yeah.
But the majority of the country is, so Kiev can fall, but everybody else is going to keep fighting.
Yeah.
So it's going to be something to watch.
It is something to watch, and they're getting a lot more resistance than they thought that they were going to get. So
It said yesterday on the news that the Germans are going to send them anti-tank missiles and or anti-airplane surface air missiles. Why they didn't do that before, I don't know.
well, I'm hoping that NATO doesn't get sucked into this whole thing, and
Excuse me.
my son would probably be involved. He flies the KC-135, the refuelers, and he was involved in that Libyan situation years ago. But anyway, you don't want to have political advantage to either the north or the south. And so Jerusalem fit the bill perfectly. Unfortunately, the Jebusites were already there in the fortress of Zion. And by the way, this is the first time in the Bible that Zion is mentioned. Zion is the name of the hill in the southeastern part of the city of Jerusalem. But it was also used as a synonym for Jerusalem itself. The Jebusites were a holdout Canaanite tribe who were never defeated by Israel during their conquest under Joshua. So whoever has Joshua 15:63, please read.
But the tribe of Judah could not drive out the Jebusites who lived in the city of Jerusalem. So the Jebusites lived there among the people of Judah to this day.
Okay. So now think about this, and if you keep in mind that the conquest of Canaan began roughly about 14 BC, okay? And that David reigned from about 1011 BC.
1400.
What did I say?
You said 14 BC.
1400 BC, I'm sorry, 1400 BC. And that David reigned from about 1011 BC to 971 BC. The Jebusites had lived there in Jerusalem for well over 400 years at the time of Joshua, after the time of Joshua. And I don't know how long they lived there before the time of Joshua. But they've been there at least 400 years. So, they ain't going nowhere. And so after David and his army marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites began to taunt David and his men. And so I guess we would say today, slang talk, they began to talk smack. You know what it means to talk smack?
Yeah.
Okay, they were trash talking the Israelites. Now, we used to do the same thing when I was a kid, and you might recall this. We would be playing basketball or whatever, and we'd say something. We would talk trash to people when we were playing basketball. And one of the favorite ones was "Yo mama wears combat boots."
How'd you know about my mama?
Now, what does that mean? I mean, I never figured that out, but that was a big insult back when we were growing up, Jamie. Now, that was back before women could serve as soldiers, remember. And today, your mama may very well wear combat boots. But look at verse 6. It says, the king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites said to David, you will not get in here. Even the blind and lame can ward you off. They thought David cannot get in here. Do any of you remember there was a mini-series on TV 40-some years ago called Masada? Anybody remember that?
Yeah.
And you remember Masada? Man, how did anybody ever conquer Masada? It was up in the mountains. I mean, you know, you could have your grandmother with a water pistol holding off people, you know? Even if she was blind, you know, you'd think nobody would be able to take that. And so I think that the Jebusites felt that they were impregnable. And so they're talking all this trash talk. And this overconfidence likely stemmed from the fact that Jerusalem, due to its high elevation, was very well positioned from a defensive standpoint. Okay? Now, does anybody play chess here? No chess players? Okay, we have a couple chess players. I was a chess coach for 14 years on the high school level, and I played at the University of Maryland. I played on a very, very excellent high school team, and I also, you know, I taught a lot of chess when I was a coach. And one of the things that I would teach is that the center of the board is called, you know what it is? It's called the mountain. And that much of the battle in chess is over the mountain. Now, why the mountain? Where were castles usually located? On mountains or high ground. Why? Because it was easier to defend. All right. So, they felt that they were impregnable because of their high ground. And David and his men even engage in a little bit of trash talking themselves. And so they throw the taunt back at them. They call those who lived in Jerusalem the blind and the lame. Now, this verbal jousting between the Jebusites and David even give birth to a proverbial saying that the blind and the lame will not enter the palace. Now, I'm wondering, what in the world does that have to do with this? The palace. And what this means is anybody's guess. Some has interpreted as referring it not to the palace itself, but to the temple, and that it was a reference to the fact that disabled people were not allowed to serve in the temple or the tabernacle. Did you know that? Who has Leviticus chapter 21, verses 16 to 21?
I did.
Would you read that, please?
Okay. The Lord said, excuse me. The Lord said to Moses, "Say to Aaron, for the generations to come, none of your descendants who has a defect may come near to offer the food of his God. No man who has any defect may come near. No man who is blind or lame, disfigured or deformed, no man with a crippled foot or hand, or who is hunchbacked or dwarfed, or who has any eye defect, or who has any festering or running sores and damaged testicles." One more verse. No descendant of Aaron, the priest, who has any defect is to come near to the present. The offering is made to the Lord by fire. He has a defect. He must not come near to offer the food of his God.
Denny, you're out, man, with the eye problems you
That's
have.
right, you're gone.
Of course, we're all, most of us are too old anyway.
Hey, as an umpire, I'm out also, I'm blind, so look at that.
Yeah, I've heard that.
I can't see that.
I've heard that you can't see straight, so
I can't see at all.
I have a saying when I play horseshoes. Even a blind man can see that it's a ringer. So they tease me about that. But, you know, we have literally thousands of, or hundreds at least, of proverbial sayings in the English language. And many of them are, you know, pretty easy to understand the meaning. You know, for example, all that glitters is not gold. What's that mean? Just because it looks good doesn't mean that it is good. I mean, you know, a good-looking woman, a good-looking man, that doesn't mean that he's a good catch. You know, you can have a woman who really looks good, who could be the worst shrew, you know. Now, I was lucky. I married a beautiful woman that turned out to be a good, really good catch for me.
More brownie points.
So, honey, did I say it right? A picture is worth 1,000 words.
Yeah.
What's it mean?
Well, it just means this.
Oh, come on, y'all. Y'all are slow. A picture is worth 1,000 words.
Question's too easy, Bob.
Tell us the story. It means a lot.
A bird and beggars can't be choosers.
Take what's given.
Take what you're given with thanksgiving. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush.
You know when to hold it, know when to fold it.
Yeah. I think I told you we're listening to this book on CD, One Summer by Bill Bryson. And there was a woman, and I can't remember her name, but in the summer of, I think that year, she swam the English Channel in a record time, faster than men have ever done it. And they were, people were clamoring to get her to be, for endorsements. And her agent would not allow them to sign with anybody. And so eventually they found out that she was pretty homely looking. And the endorsements dried up. And so they were hoping that they were going to get more, two in the bush,
Yeah.
and they turned down the bird in the hand.
Not smart.
Okay, not smart. All right, just another one here for fun. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.
Confucius saying.
Yeah.
Uh,
Now these are really easy to understand, aren't they? But what about another one like a stitch in time saves 9?
It won't tear if you repair it. It
Uh,
won't tear further
If you do
if
it
you
correctly,
repair it.
repair it correctly.
well, I think what it means is that it's better to deal with problems right away than let them become bigger. Or how about necessity is the mother
It's
of
better
invention?
for Carrie to check the oil in the car before driving it, is what that means.
Necessity is the mother of invention. In other words, when you really need something, you find a way to meet the need. Okay, and so we could go on and on, but whatever it meant to the 10th century BC Israelite, the blind and the lame will not enter the palace. Frankly, I have no idea. Its precise meaning is lost to us today. Now, it's a good thing, I think, and I'll just stop with this, that David and the Jebusites didn't have to deal with the ACLU, or they would have both been in hot water for their views on disabled persons. However, since David showed kindness later on in the story to Mephibosheth, who was crippled, I don't think that David was trying to be unkind to disabled people. So anyway, I'm going to stop right there. We'll pick it up next week. Any thoughts, questions? Yeah, Denny.
For next week, Bob, when you visit Israel on a tour, they will bring up the whole issue of, was David really the king over all of Israel? Over the northern and southern kingdom? And I just would like to hear your thoughts on that. Not now, but that was pretty prominent in our last visit to Israel by the local guide.
Let me think about it. Let me think.